At this time, I'd like to introduce Karin Hess. It's great to be here. There's a lot of places where, like someone will mention SBEC, and people in the audience will say, what's that? So it's always nice to be in a place where you actually know what we're talking about when you say, smarter balance assessment comes up. A lot of times I have to put up a map and say, these are the states, and you're one of them. That's good to know you're one of them. What we say is, there's park and there's smarter balance, and if you've joined one of those, it's like you're going steady with one of those. But then there are other states that are sort of like dating around still, they're deciding who they like best. But Connecticut is one of those that's going steady with smarter balance right now, and as Holly said, it will replace, that new assessment will replace the current state assessment. So before I get started, it just helps me, and I have a sense of who you are, but it would just help me to know if you would just tell me your first name. I'm not going to remember any of them probably. Your first name, and just what your role is. It gives me a sense of who is in the room. If you specifically work with math or ELA, or if you're a principal, this kind of gives me a sense of. It's great to know that there's some special ed representation here. One of the things I recommended yesterday when we were talking is, I don't think we've done a good job, and I'll include myself as both a teacher and a curriculum director, in designing curriculum so that it's accessible to all students. And so that's one of my new soapboxes, that we really need to have a placeholder to say, well, if we're going to do these performance tests, if we're going to do these higher level, more rigorous kinds of things with all students, and I do believe all students can learn, we have to also think about how to make them more accessible. So it's good to see you have that representation here. We're going to start just by developing a shared understanding of cognitive rigor. And we'll find out pretty quickly that we probably right now don't all have the same definition. And then we'll start to, once we sort of get some common understanding and some discussion, then we'll look at examples and we'll be able to say, so is this rigorous? What would make this more rigorous? And I have some examples for us to look at. And then by the afternoon, we'll start to talk about, so what can you take back to your classrooms? What can you take into your curriculum work as you move forward? So why should we care about rigor? So this is morning in the kitchen, and Mom and Dad are talking, and she says, Hillary's spelling test is today, Ted. Can you give her one last run through? And Dad says, sure. He starts with erosion. She says, that's not the first word, Dad. How can I spell them if you jumble them up? He says, you only know them in order? I don't know them. I memorized them. Nobody said anything about having to know them. And I think that's been the problem. Lots of kids have memorized stuff, but didn't really know it in a deep way. So it's that mile-wide and inch-deep curriculum. We try to cover so much that we never really get deep understanding of a lot of that. So I want everybody right now to take a minute to write your personal definition of cognitive rigor. When you hear that phrase, what does it mean when you're thinking about either instruction or assessment or curriculum? What is cognitive rigor? If something is rigorous, what does that mean? And there is blank paper there if you didn't form any for notes. Jot that down. I'm going to ask you to do, not as like full giant table groups, but in no more than 3s or 4s, so kind of section yourselves off. I'd like you to share what you wrote with 3 or 4 people sitting near you, and listen for, you might circle them or just note, what do you have in common with your definition and the other ones, and what's slightly different? So you're just kind of trying to find some commonality in how you're thinking about it right now. So just share in small groups of 3 or 4. So what were some of the words that you had in common, the descriptions you seem to have in common with the people sitting near you? Just sort of call out. What were some of the phrases that you kind of agreed on? Application of knowledge. A lot of people have something like that.
Immersion.
Immersion. What do you mean by immersion?
Just, Lisa can explain it better because she had that and we all agreed that that was an excellent word.
Okay, Lisa?
We were talking about so many times you feel like a lot of things you're doing like a tourist approach, like just a little bit here or there, but the kids really don't have enough time to be immersed into it and get a complete understanding.
Okay, so not drive-by. You're actually going to stay for a while at that place. Some other phrasing that you agreed on.
Challenges or deeper?
Okay, going deeper. Talk a little bit more about challenges.
So,
I've heard that word popping up in different places.
it's, the way I had phrased it is really, challenges students at their level. So it's like, what's that scaffolded expectation?
Okay, so that's a little bit different than just challenge. So I heard you say challenge with scaffolding. Because I could give you something really, really hard and not help you figure out how to do it. And then it would just, what would you do? Give up. Say, well, here's a two-wheel bike. Good luck. No, put the training wheels on. And then we take the training wheels off, we hold on to the seat, and we run behind the bike. And then at some point we let go and hope that they're pedaling fast enough to maintain the balance. Any other phrases that you have that you kind of agree on? Did you have things that maybe weren't exactly the same with your definitions? Did anybody read your definition and other people said, that's exactly what I wrote? Okay, so that's part of the problem is we don't have a common definition. So part of the purpose of just having these conversations is to get closer to something that we can agree is rigorous or not rigorous as we work together to create sort of a systemic approach. So now let's just use whatever your definitions are right now and imagine that your class has just read some version of Little Red Riding Hood. I don't care what grade level, kindergarten, 8th grade, doesn't matter. With the same people that you just had a conversation with, 3 or 4 people, I want you to come up with 2 questions, a basic comprehension question and a more rigorous question. Now, I use Little Red Riding Hood because I always make the assumption everybody knows the story, but I did have a workshop where somebody says that the one with the 3 pigs. No, it's not the one with the 3 pigs. It's where Little Red is going to the woods and it's going to grandmother's house with the basket of goodies. Okay, so that's the story I'm talking about, but it could be any version of it. So you've got about 5 minutes to come up with a basic comprehension question and a more rigorous question at the end of reading that text. And you're working together. Does everybody have their 2 questions? Which question was the easier question to write? Yeah, the basic question. That's always the easier one. What I'm going to ask you to do is just set those questions aside for a minute. I'm going to go through a few slides and then we'll come back. Okay? So I'm going to talk a little bit about my work with cognitive rigor. There is an article in your packet that you don't have to dig out right now, but it's got most of what I'm going to say in the next few slides. So I know what it's like when you're trying to process, and I'm always frantically taking notes and everything. I'm going to talk too fast, I've got to get all this information. But I just want you to know that is in the bottom of your packet. And it was written back in 2009 for a presentation I did at a national conference, but my work with cognitive rigor goes back a little further, and so I'll just talk a little bit about how this matrix came to be. So I work with a lot of states at the Center for Assessment. I spent 25 years working in schools, but in the last 10 I've been working with departments of education, with states, with school districts. And what I found early on was everybody has a different way to describe rigor. Okay, I graduated and started teaching in 1972, so I learned all about Bloom's taxonomy. I did workshops as a curriculum person with Bloom's taxonomy. Bloom's taxonomy talks about what type of thinking are you doing, and it's based on verbs. In my work at the Center for Assessment, I became aware of a second model which intrigued me, and it's Webb's depth of knowledge, and it's not a taxonomy. It talks about how deeply you have to know the content in order to interact with it. So, just a little history of both of those. In 1956, Bloom's taxonomy was developed. It wasn't just Benjamin Bloom, although it's always called Bloom's taxonomy. But there were a couple other guys, one of whom was a guy by the name of David Craftwell. And they actually developed several. They had both affective and cognitive taxonomies, but it's only this cognitive taxonomy that we kind of remember or work with in schools. And it goes from knowledge to evaluation. Well, in 2001, a new version came out. It's called the Revised Bloom's Taxonomy. David Craftwell, now an older guy, sort of a mentor to some other people, actually contributed to the work in this. And they've done some rethinking of the ordering. So you notice the ordering is slightly different. What do you notice most about the order of the taxonomy in the revised?
So left two flip-flop.
Yeah, the last two have flip-flop. Because when Bloom developed this, he developed it based on the kinds of questions that were asked on exams in college. But as he thought about it, as we always do, once you put something in print and then you like learn more and you think more about it, you say, oh darn, I wish I had said it differently. He always sort of agonized over the fact that evaluation and synthesis were not reversed, because writing the great novel is a lot harder than critiquing the great novel. So when you think about it, the creative process of putting new ideas together, producing new knowledge, is at a much higher level in a taxonomy. So they sort of did that correction. You also will see, though, that there's a problem with the verbs, and that is that sometimes the same verbs show up on different levels. So even if you would do an internet search of Bloom's taxonomy, you'd find slightly different versions of it, with slightly different verbs. So that's been a shortfall of it. It describes the kind of thinking you're doing, but it shifts around and it doesn't talk about depth of understanding. So now enter Webb's depth of knowledge. And when I first heard Webb's depth of knowledge, I thought, okay, this must be something like webbing or norming. His name is Norman Webb. I didn't really know it was a guy named Norman, but it's a guy named Norman Webb. And he did this really important study when states were mandated to have grade level standards, and there was all this shifting towards writing grade level standards. Before then, a lot of states had maybe a test at 4th grade, and another one at 8th grade, one in high school. So when all that was changing in the early 90s, and we're really thinking about writing standards, he did a study where he looked at the state standards and the state test. And what he said and what he found in many, many states, he did studies of four very large states. He said the rigor that's described in the standards is usually not assessed on the test. So the rigor that was described, the challenge that we were saying we were teaching kids to do, we were not really asking those kinds of questions on a large-scale assessment. And that was huge, because what it caused all states to have to start thinking about is, if you put it in your standards and you say you're going to teach it, then you have to assess it. You can't just go for the low-level memorize, the things you can memorize and test easily. That was huge. It opened up a whole different way of looking at it. And he created 4 levels, and he says this is not a taxonomy. The goal isn't get to 4, like 1 is bad and 4 is good. It's 4 different ways that you interact with content. First level is to be able to recall facts, terms, principles. That's important. We need that. But that was what he was finding was tested on most tests, is that DOK1. And DOK2 is basic application. So can I organize data? Can I interpret a simple graph? Can I use some information in some way that's pretty much routine? But it's a little bit harder than the DOK1, because I maybe have to get information from a graph or table, and then I have to apply that maybe to find an average. So I have to know how to do multiple things, not multiple steps, but I have to make a decision. What information do I use and how do I apply it? So if I were to ask, who's the main character, you would have to know what a main character is, and then you have to apply it in this story. You look at 2 or 3 characters and say, well, this must be the main character. So there's kind of a 2-step process, as opposed to what was the name of the little girl in the story, Red. See the difference between a 1 and a 2? So 1 it takes a little bit more thinking, it's a little bit deeper. I have to know something about how a story is put together to answer the second question. DOK3 he calls strategic thinking, and that has to require some kind of reasoning or planning to get to the answer. It could be that there's more than one right answer, and there's different ways to approach it. So if I said, what do you think is a theme of a story? There might be more than one right answer, depending on how you justify your answer. That's the key to DOK3, is you have to provide support. You can't just say, and this is the thing that irks me about the media when they interview people. They ask them a question, what do you think about that? I think that was stupid, but they never ask them for justification. They never ask them to back it up with some facts. If it's math and problem solving, it might be a non-routine problem that I might have multiple ways to solve it, but I have to explain what my thinking was to solve it in the way that I did. Or maybe I'm asked to solve it in another way to prove that my answer is right. DOK3 is not just telling you I did this step, then I did that step, then I did that step. That's not DOK3. It's what reasoning did I use? Well, I knew that this was true, or I knew that these fractions were equal, so I was able to apply that in this case. This looked like a problem I saw before, and I applied how I solved it the last time in a new context. So that's a DOK3. So if I'm going to put together writing an essay, it's a DOK3. I have a topic, I'm going to organize my paragraphs to support that topic, I'm going to provide details and evidence and elaboration. A DOK4 he calls extended thinking. And that's something that usually takes longer, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're doing low-level skills over a month. We're going to take the temperature outside for a month. That's not extended thinking. Taking the temperature, reading the temperature would be DOK1. Recording the temperature and organizing it in a graph or a chart over a month would be a DOK2. I'm organizing the data. But then starting to think about, well, how does this compare, this month compare with another month? I'm getting into maybe non-routine. What happens if there's a shift in a weather pattern? Now I'm getting into some other concepts that I have to bring into it. It's not just a right or wrong answer. That would be moving it to a 3. If I wanted to really make it an extended project, I would have to design something where I want to know, is global warming, is there evidence of global warming here? And now I have to go, and I've got to maybe read and find data from a lot of different sources and begin to synthesize it. If I wanted to know, if I wanted to assign a research project and I want students to read multiple texts on that same topic, find information from a variety and synthesize that information, that's a DOK4. It takes longer to do because you're synthesizing more information. If I want students to read multiple texts by the same author, or to look at artwork and advertisements and what was going on in a period of history, that's a DOK4. So a DOK4 tends to be something that requires some research, some problem solving. It's generally non-routine, it's usually real-world based. There's a reason why you want that information. And it often goes across disciplines or across content areas. So it's like humanities types projects, or a math science project where you're applying both math and science concepts. So those are the two models. And when I started working with states, people would say, I would be using Webb, because it just made a little bit more sense to me to talk about Rigor using Bact and Bloom. And people would say to me, well, it's just the same as Bloom. And I said, no, I don't think it is. And they said, well, and how is it different? Which forced me to try to think about, well, then how is it different? I sort of love and hate those kind of questions because then I can't let go. Well, if I say it's not the same, it's got to be different. So here's what I know about. So I started to think, well, DOK isn't about difficulty. If you ever watch Jeopardy, you know that those are people who can do DOK like to the max. They remember a lot of stuff, and it's hard. I could never win any money on Jeopardy because you got to know a lot of stuff. But so it's not about difficulty, it's about complexity of the content. The intended student learning is about the mental processing of that, so it's not about the verbs either. So I've got 3 examples here. Bloom's is about the verb. So I said, well, What Webb says is what comes after the verb that's really important. So if I ask you to describe a process of photosynthesis, what mental processing would you need to engage in to be able to do that? What would you be doing if I'm asking you to describe a process? You'd be memorizing. You either know it or you don't. There's kind of a right answer and a wrong answer. You can't do like reasoning with that, really. If I said, describe how two political parties are alike and different, what would you have to know to be able to answer that question? You'd have to know something about each of those parties, and then you'd have to be able to compare and contrast. So that's kind of a DOK2, where you're saying, how are they alike, how are they different? We often say, how are these two characters alike or different? When we do sorting, we say, with numbers, like, categorize these as prime or not prime numbers, or odd or even numbers. When we do categorizing and sorting and saying how they're alike and how they're different, we're doing DOK2 kinds of thinking, mental processing. If I said describe the most significant effect of World War II on the nations of Europe, how many chunks of kinds of information would you have to be pulling together? What would be some of those? You'd have to know what?
What are the nations in Europe?
What are the nations? Who are the nations? Okay. What else would you have to know?
What are some of the effects?
What were some of the effects? You also have to know what makes it significant or not significant. So you have to know cause and effect of some of those things. That's a DOK4. That's the kind of term paper that you might get at the end of world history course in high school, where you're kind of pulling together things you've learned throughout the year, and then could you have more than one different answers to that? And how would you, as a teacher, be grading that? You'd be grading it based on the support that's provided. So we might come up with 3 or 4 different significant effects, and the way we articulate it shows how deeply we understood that content. So, thinking about how is that different from Bloom, I laid out Bloom's levels across the top: recall, skills, strategic thinking, extended thinking, and Bloom's revised taxonomy down the side. And then I started to say, well, where they intersect, what would that be like? And you have this in your folder in a couple different versions, but if the one on top, if you look way up in the corner where my finger is, it says ELA on one. You might want to just circle that so you know that's the one with the ELA descriptors, and there's a second one that says math science. So they're set up in the same way, but the descriptors are slightly different for the content area. So the way you lay it out is saying, well, what would be recall in remembering? It's recalling or locating facts. What would be understanding in ELA? Be maybe saying, this word makes sense in a sentence. So I'm reading for meaning. What would it mean in applying? Maybe I'm applying my knowledge of synonyms and antonyms to tell you what word means the same or different, or if I add a prefix on, how's that going to change the meaning of a word? I might be able to tell you what kind of information is in a graph or a chart, but I'm not actually doing any interpretation. I might be able to just, at a basic level, it's a very low level analysis, be able to tell you what's this diagram telling you. There really is no example of evaluating at a real low level, unless it's just an unsubstantiated opinion. I hate it. And creating, if you think of the first part of the creative process, usually just brainstorming ideas, like what could I write about? No judgment, just kind of putting it out on the table. All of those, even though there's a lot of variety there, are at a DOK1. And then you move over to 2, and when you get to 2, you're starting to put some ideas together. If you're a reading teacher, a DOK1 is usually a right there question. You can find it in the text. If you're a math teacher, a DOK1 is just a routine operation. Once I teach you how to add, no matter what you're going to add, you're going to do it the same way all the time. Doesn't matter if the numbers get bigger, it's still the same process. The same is true with long division. It's still following up a bunch of steps. doing it the same way every time. It's routine. And the thinking, it's not like applying division to finding an average. Finding an average is a little bit more difficult. You have to know a couple of steps. You have to know what numbers you're going to choose, and then you have to know how to add them and find an average, and you have to know if you're going to find the mean, the mode, and the median. So that would be a DOK too. That's routine in that there's a way to find mean, mode, and median, but you've got to make some decisions along the way to decide. Maybe sometimes tests will ask a question, which is the best way to describe this average. So you're kind of making a decision about it. Okay? You're summarizing what's in a text, you're identifying the main ideas, you're using context to say, well, this word would mean this in this context, but it means something else in another context. You might be comparing literary elements. You might be making predictions, logical predictions. That's DOK too. So now we're going to return to your Little Red Riding Hood questions. Where would you say most of your basic questions fell? Yeah, you probably had them recalling some facts, or maybe identifying characters or something like that, right? Probably. You might have had them retell or summarize the sequence of events of the story. You might have had 2 in there. And sometimes you might even have a creative summary, but it's creative, it's still a summary. So an example might be, there is a template in your folder. If you go one template further, you see a Little Red Riding Hood template. So my example there would be, read a telephone conversation between Little Red Riding Hood and her mother that explains the wolf incident. That's a summary, but it's a creative summary. So I might, as a teacher, say, well, I'm going to make this a little bit more challenging. It's going to be challenging because it's being creative, but it's not necessarily going deeper. I'm still going to be looking for, did you get this part? Did you get this part? Did you get this part? Did you put the sequence of events together? Is the right answer. I have 2 examples on my little template for what a 3 and a 4 might be. My level 3 was, well, now I want you to make a judgment. I'm asking you for your opinion about the intelligence or the cleverness of the wolf. Was the wolf clever? Was the wolf intelligent? You justify your response using support from the text. So I think he was, or I think he wasn't, and this is why, and this is my supporting evidence. That takes you deeper into the story. It doesn't, unless there's a line in the story that says this was a clever wolf, and then you can't ask this question, because then it becomes a right there question. Oh yeah, on line 7, it says, so you have to be careful what text you choose. You have to actually read them. Guilty, I did text it. When I was a teacher, sometimes I didn't really read it carefully. And then I got tripped up when I was asking these difficult questions. But you have to justify your responses. And then my level 4 is going to other sources beyond the text. So now I'm saying, are all wolves in literature portrayed in the same way? Now you have to go to at least one other text. And now you're reading this text and you're saying, what was the wolf like there? What was the wolf like here? And where does your evidence come from? Multiple texts. So, your job now is to use the Little Red Riding Hood template. Where were your questions? And can you come up with maybe a few more now that you've seen the template? So decide, where did yours fall? You might have hit a level 3, but most people are still in level 2 with their challenging. So let's hear a few examples of what you think a good rigorous question might be. We don't have to spend time saying, let's hear 10 examples of low-level questions. We've all heard them. We know what they sound like. Okay, so let's hear, and I'm going to be a good DOK3, I'm going to model good DOK3 teaching, because when you tell me what your question is, I'm going to ask you why you think it's a higher level question. So you're going to have to provide some support for your answer, which is what I would want teachers to be doing in a classroom when students respond. I say, why do you think that? Tell me your thinking behind that. Why do you say it's this and not that? Okay? So now the pressure's on. Okay. And I have to know why I think that's what it is. So let's hear some examples of some rigorous questions that you came up with. And Do you think it's a 3 or a 4? And what's your justification for thinking that? Yes, thank you. A brave person. It's always good. Go first because you don't have to talk. And then if she doesn't do a good job, then you're like, well, I could do that.
So we had, what would have happened if Little Red had arrived at Grandma's house before the wolf got there? And we thought it was a DOK3 under creating because the student had to synthesize the entire story and then develop an alternative solution to the story.
Wow, that's good. I'm glad you got that on tape. Good job. Yes, a lot of times people think if you write a new ending or you change the story in some way, it's a DOK4. But you have the same characters, you have the same setting, you have the setup for the plot, and you're being creative with it. So it has to be justified by being consistent with what those characters, so you have to know the characters well, but you can be creative with them. So that's a good example of a 3. You're creating a new story using the same characters, sort of the same setting, the same information. As a matter of fact, another example, I was reading USA Today this morning in my hotel, and Grey's Anatomy is going to have an episode, I think tonight, Thursday, tonight, where it's like, what if this person hadn't left, this person hadn't married this person? They're actually doing a DOK3 episode. Because they're running out of ideas for DOK4, like new ideas. That's a good example of a DOK3. Thank you. Another great person. Thank you.
We wrote, what other story characters remind you of the wolf and why? And we put that at a 4 because we were, extending our thinking by, having kids have to go pull into their memory other characters and other stories. They don't have to be wolves. It could be just other villains. And, what are some of the characteristics like luring and
Right. You're on the right track, but I would rephrase your question to say, instead of just saying why, what evidence can you use to support your answer? Because then it can't just be totally from memory. I might have to actually go back to that text or those multiple texts and say, these were things that character 1 did, these were things that character 2 did, and my conclusion is they were both villains. And I'm trying to, because what you're trying to get kids to do is generalize, to transfer ideas, to say, oh, a villain, that's an archetype of a character. You're starting to build that as when you're starting to read stories with kids, they start to understand. There's a lot of clues in a text that tell you if it's a good guy or a bad guy, if it's a hero or a villain. And you're trying to get them to generalize that across multiple texts. And then the creepy stories are the ones where you think the good guy is the good guy and then suddenly they become the bad guy. That's what makes mysteries kind of take a twist on that, but we want students to be able to generalize that. So always remember to add that using evidence to support your idea. Don't just say why, because it could go personal. Yes, thanks.
We had said, do you think Red's mother should have sent her alone to her grandmother's house? Justify your response using details or evidence from the text. And we had put that as a level 3 because they would need to cite evidence and develop a logical argument for their opinion.
You're a wonderful class. I don't think you guys can go home. Good. That's good. When you stay within the text, it's a 3. And I like the way you said use evidence from the text because, well, it's obvious. Because you're just staying within the one source of evidence. Another one. Yes, thanks.
I changed it for the evidence piece. How has the story evolved over time in our culture, and what evidence, why do you think this happened, and what evidence is there?
And what do you think that is?
For, because we have to really analyze the culture and look at society and use multiple resources to do that.
Okay, read your question again so we can hear, because I think we can fine tune your question.
Yeah,
I think you're on the verge of a good DOK4 question.
It's really hard to write it out. So,
Right, so just read it again so we can process.
How has the story evolved over time in our
Okay, stop. How has the story evolved over time? What does that, I know what I was thinking when you said that. What are you thinking when you hear that phrase? What would students have to do? How has the story evolved over time? Different versions. When I do this activity out west, they read the Grimm's fairy tale version. They hate wolves out there. And they'll say, you're from the East, aren't you? I said, yeah, we read like the Disney version in the East. So that implies multiple versions over time. Now keep going with your question.
And then
And
I said,
society,
what evidence, or why do you think this has happened, and what evidence can you use to prove it?
okay. So now you not only have to find text from a time period, but what was going on at that time. So we know Grimm's fairy tales are really about like, listen to your parents, don't go running off in the woods by yourself. They were really to teach lessons, and that was, so you have to sort of know that time, and where did the text come from other times, and what were maybe some of the values. So that's actually a pretty high level thing that older kids might really be curious about, wondering why are there different versions of the same text. So fine tuning it so that it's like, I might add a second sentence to that. You will need to read multiple versions and be able to articulate what was happening at those time periods in order to answer this question, because that's a very complex one. But it could be a really interesting one. It could be one where different groups of kids would read different versions and do the research on that time period, and maybe as a class, you're kind of pulling that together. DOK4 doesn't have to be like every individual student. As a matter of fact, Howard Gardner once said, everything in life is a project, and we rarely do them alone. We always get help from someone. So when it's a really complex project, usually you are getting advice from other people. And so DOK4 activities are often very well designed as projects, group, at least some parts of it being grouped, to pull ideas together. Students might come up with their own individual products in the end, but some of that research might happen as a whole class or groups doing different pieces of it. Any comments up to this point of what we've talked about? Okay, so some general rules of thumb. If there's a correct answer, it's going to be a DOK 1 or 2. DOK 1 is you know it or you don't know it. You can locate it, you can do it, you can recall it. And often, if you just teach kids how to do it, then they suddenly can do it.
Can it be the same, like, I'm thinking math again, you come to the same answer but using different process, like, so, you know, there's an answer at the end of solving system equations, but people are choosing methods based on.
Right, usually when you evaluate an expression, for example, in mathematics, you either know how to evaluate an expression or you don't. You might come about it slightly differently, but there's a right answer. And yes, so my answer is yes. As long as you know how to do it in some way and can get the answer, it's going to be a 1. 2 is going to be something where you maybe have to apply 2 different ideas to get there. But again, there's a right answer. So I think
Okay,
I've said,
that would be the 2.
Right.
I gave would be a 2.
right. If, though, there's more than one possible solution or more than one possible approach that you actually are having to articulate, why did you use that? Why did you think that approach? So it's not just using a different approach to get the right answer. So if I said blah, 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 here's the question, and you say 82 and you say 82, but you did it differently. Right now, I don't know if you use different approaches or why you use different approaches or what reasoning you use behind that. Maybe you got the right answers for the wrong reasons. So until I actually probe and say, what's your reasoning behind the approach you used? That pushes students to be metacognitive about their process. Now, if you've spent any time reading the Common Core math practices, you know it's a lot about perseverance, precision, problem solving, looking for patterns. So that's where you're going to know if that's the kind of thing that's in their head while they're doing that problem-solving task. And if you only give routine kinds of things that could be done in 2 different ways, well, I'll show you an example in a minute and see what I mean. But a 4 is not only are you having to show your reasoning, but you also are using multiple data sources, multiple texts, multiple concepts are kind of coming together. It's a non-routine kind of thing. It's what you do on the weekend when something breaks in your house and you're trying to figure out how to fix it because you can't get a repair guy. So you're saying, well, I think this is how the toilet works, or I think this is how the electrical system works, but I also know some other things, or I've got to move this heavy thing to somewhere else, but I don't have the right tools or equipment to do that. So now you start to put together other ideas to see if you can grab the duct tape and the whatever. Right, yes, right. But that's what you're doing, you're using multiple sources of evidence to sort of say, maybe I can put this together and do something. Although I did have trouble, I'm terrible at technology, okay, I'll just say that. I finally, I live in the mountains in Vermont. We just got high-speed internet about 4 months ago. I've been using dial-up for years. I just got an iPhone, and I don't know, I can make phone calls, okay, but I can't do wireless. I figured out how to get my email. So, but the other day, just everything was black. I couldn't turn it, it was on, but I couldn't turn it off. I couldn't get it to do anything. So I sent this email out to all the people I work with. I'm like, I have this problem. I know some of you have iPhones, does anybody know? And somebody said, well, nobody had ever had the problem. They weren't surprised because I am the only one who has a problem with technology. They said, but I did Google it, and what came up was the black screen of death. I think I have that. The black screen of death. So that is a way to find other sources. So I was going up for other different sources to kind of solve my problem. Okay. So we're going to look at some examples from both ELA and math now. And so how does this conceptually apply when you're looking at an assignment or an assessment or whatever? But before we go on, any questions up to this point? So we're combining types of thinking with depth of thinking right now. And I'm going to show you some examples. Just get out of here. So I have this little formative assessment that I developed called Bookmark. You don't have it in your packet, but you can have it if you want it. I think I sent it to Holly. Yeah. So here's how a bookmark works. This gets cut in half, so you either use the left side or the right side, it becomes a bookmark while you're reading. So it's a little formative tool that as you read, you're making notes. And I'm using it as a formative tool because I want to know if my students can do whatever I'm asking them to do. I'm giving them purpose for reading and looking to see if they can do it. So on the left-hand side, they put in their name, they put the text, they put the author of the text, and then it says, as you read this text, you're looking for text features. So you're looking to see, did I see headings? Did I see graphs? Did I see photos? Did I see vocabulary? Did I see some other things? And I just have to include, did I see it? And then I have to provide a page reference. Okay? So what do you think I'm teaching right now? Non-fiction text, informational text, and I'm helping them to understand there's more than just the words. There's other information in the text and the way it's organized that's going to help them to understand the kind of information they'll find. Okay? And would you say that's, if I'm just asking them to locate it, where do you think that falls in depth of knowledge? And use your ELA sheet and look down. Can you find a descriptor under column 1 that would sort of describe what they're doing? They're identifying and locating. How about under the low-level analysis? Identify whether there's information in a graphic. It's kind of like that. Describe, maybe they're recalling what a heading is. So, but it's definitely in that column 1, isn't it? So if I use this little tool, I need to know how deeply I'm going to get with that tool. That's the point. It's not that it's bad, because it might be important to know if they know what a heading or whatever is. And what I might want to do in the next lesson is say, where can you find information about or use the information to do something with it? But if they don't know what those things are, they're going to be stalled. So the idea here is, look at what you're using and just ask yourself, how far is this going to take them? It's going to take them, they're going to be in DLK 1 land, they're going to get some basic foundational stuff. Now let's look at the one on the right side. As you read this text, please note text references, including pages. This early on, if you don't make them right where they found it, they probably didn't find it. And they can't find it again. That will help you to answer questions. So I'm going to give them a question to answer. So think back to your Little Red Riding Hood questions. If you said, what color was Red's cape? Okay, you might have asked that question. What color was Red's cape? On page 1 in line 1, it says Red put on her red cape. That's why she was called Red, because she's wearing around this little red cape. So what level would that be? Oh, I don't recall. If I said something like some of the other questions that you suggested, like how would you change the story, what does that do? Bumps it up to a 2 or a 3. And why would I want them to include pages? Because this is best used for something where I really want them to think and search and find the information and do some reading between the lines. And those are the hardest questions for kids to answer and provide support for. They could say it's a funny story. Why is it a funny story? Well, I'm not really sure. We'll go back into the text and find things in the story that you think made you smile, laugh, what was humorous about the way the author used words. So there's an example of a little formative tool you could use over and over again, but with intent you could be thinking about, well, now I want them to go deeper. So that's just a little one called Bookmark. And I like it because it's quick, simple, quickly collect it, take a quick skim and decide kids get it or they don't get it. Now I'm going to show you one, and I don't know if I sent you T-Bear. I don't think I sent this to Holly, but this is one I love. Has anyone ever heard of T-Bear? Okay. A year or 2 ago, I had never heard of it. It is one of the coolest graphic organizers to get to a deeper level. So each letter of T-B-E-A-R stands for something. That's where T-Bear comes from. And if you Google T-Bear, you will get all kinds of examples and stuff out there. I heard it from a friend of mine, a colleague of mine who worked with me in Rhode Island. So here's the sample writing prompt. After reading the story Little Red Riding Hood, what's your opinion about the intelligence or cleverness of the wolf? So what did we decide? What kind of a question is that? DLK 3, right? What's your opinion about the cleverness of the wolf, and then support your opinion with evidence. So I'm going for a DLK 3 on this. Now here's the way I want my students to set up their responses, so this is how I want them to think about taking notes. T is your topic sentence, your thesis, your claim, your focus, your opinion. And an example might be in the story Little Riding Hood, the author creates a character that is clearly very intelligent or not very intelligent. So I'm going to make a statement, make a claim. My B is my brief explanation. This is a little summary of the story. So in these first 2, I'm not getting deep yet. But I'm saying, this is a story about a girl who goes to the woods, she doesn't listen to her, does whatever. This is my little summary, and I'm setting up how I'm going to provide supporting evidence. If kids can't fill in that second one, you know they didn't even get the gist, because that's a DLK 2. Now we get to 3, examples. Now we have to start to pull examples to support the stance, to support the opinion. So now I'm looking for, are they having actual evidence from the text in there that goes back and supports the opinion? A lot of kids can find that stuff, but they have trouble with the next one, analysis. How do those examples, why are they good examples? I'll give you, so when I have kids use this as an organizer before they answer, often they can put their opinion They can give you a little summary, and they might be able to pull some examples from the text, but they don't really know why those examples support their opinion. So I might say, how does the author use language in this text to write good descriptions? And they'll say, the author is very descriptive in the text. This text is about winter. They'll have some examples there, snowboarding or snow or whatever, and then they get to analysis and they don't have anything in that little box. It's a real good way to know if they are really understanding that they've got to think about why why the evidence works. And often they can't answer or write a short constructive response if they can't get to that point. And then the last one, relate or reflect on it. Connect back to your opinion. So this kind of character is also, and this is where a student might go beyond. They might start to connect to other things outside of this text. Or this really teaches this lesson, or therefore, overall. All of these examples show that. It could be anything from a summary statement that links back, a restatement, but it's the closure that's in the Common Core all over the place. Students will have closure. Closure is a really hard thing to teach. But I find using this organizer, and I've had teachers who've come to my workshops, like back in October, and they came back for, like we've done like series of workshops, and they'll say, my ELL kids, this is like so helpful for them to do this talking through and putting the ideas down before they write. You can use this to write a paragraph, or you could use this to write an essay. But it's really how do you find this evidence and how do you analyze the evidence you're using? There's been a lot of research done with this particular TVR, and then, so this is something Holly can send out. And then the second page, I just have an example at a higher level, so I've done the same thing with Death of a Salesman. But it works really well with almost any kind of text. Once you give a prompt, I mean, it can work with social studies or science or some other areas. Why is this important? What is your evidence? What do you know about this? And what's your concluding statement? So this is an organizer that when I pick this up and I say, if I use this, what am I pushing kids to do? Go beyond summary, go beyond recall, and actually analyze. We use the verb analyze all the time. My opinion is, unless you actually are saying why the analysis actually supports your claim, you're not really analyzing. You're just kind of putting something out there. When I was doing my doctoral dissertation, I had an advisor who would write UG all over your papers. UG meant unsubstantiated generalization. You couldn't just say something like, there's a ton of research that says, and they'd write UG. It's like, oh, you mean I actually have to tell you what the research was that supports this opinion, this conclusion I'm making? So I see kids with they put a lot of UGs on their paper. They can maybe find some evidence, but they don't know how to elaborate. Why did I use that evidence? Why is it more powerful? And if they can't do it in a simple paragraph, they're not going to be able to write, arguments. They're not going to be able to write longer pieces. So it's a nice graphic organizer. And again, you can look at that. We did it yesterday with Barbara and Holly. We started, just after we had a similar conversation, we started to look at things, curriculum, examples of math problem-solving tasks. Was like, no, DOK2. No, DOK2. We're just kind of going through saying it's often the stuff that we're using, we're not even aware. We think because there's a variety, it's going deep. Or we think if we see the word analyze, it's going deep. But unless you actually push kids to analyze, and then you start to get good examples, and they see it modeled, they're not going to know. Okay, so there's a couple of ELA. Now you do have the next one that I'm going to show you, which is a fraction example. So you have this in your folder. It says doing homework together. And this is task 27, so you can kind of get the gist that it's from a book that has at least 26 other tasks. use it for a couple of reasons. I think it's a good resource. I suggest to Barbara, she may want to take a look at it. If you're teaching third, fourth, or fifth grade and you have kids struggling with understanding fractions and decimals, it's actually ordered lessons that go from simple to more difficult understanding of fractions and decimals across those years. It's all research-based, and it comes out of Australia, Western Australia. But each task is set out, they describe the purpose for the task, how you might adapt the task, how you might interpret the responses. But I'd like you to look at this page where the actual task is doing homework together. So Sienna and Co were doing homework together. As we know all kids do, they do homework together, they always have an argument about the right answer, because that's how math problem solving always seems to be set up. The question said, what is 1/8 as a decimal? And one of them says, I think it's 0.8 or 8/10, and the other one says, no, I think it's 0.125 or 125 thousandths. And then, of course, we want to know who is right, are they both right? And then it says, draw a diagram below to explain what you think. Your task with your friends is to use the math DOK chart, which is the one that has SCI because it's got math descriptors on it. What is this task calling for? DOK 1, 2, 3, or 4. Based on the question, who is right, are they both right? Draw a diagram below to explain what you think. Take a few minutes, look for something that would describe what students are being asked to do in this first part of the task. Let's deconstruct what we're asking kids to do. We're asking them, what do they have to put in that box? They have to draw a diagram to explain what you think. So what do you have to see in the box if they did what you asked them to do? You have to see a diagram. Does it say draw a diagram and explain why you think so? Yeah, so one of the reasons I use this example is that because they only have to draw a diagram, who does the interpreting of the diagram? The teacher. Oh, I think they use this diagram, so they must understand this or that, but the kids aren't necessarily being prompted to do that. So, does that help you decide what the DOK level would be? Where would it fall? Where's the description of drawing that diagram? Represent math relationships in words, pictures, or symbols. Right? Because it doesn't say. Now, the examples that you'll see in this resource, because the kids are used to probably verbally explaining, you will actually see some written explanations. But a better way to phrase that would be, draw a diagram to show your understanding and explain your reasoning for your answer, or explain why your answer, that they're the same or they're not the same, or one is right and one isn't. That would be, what would that push it to then? They have to explain their reasoning. If they have to explain their reasoning, not the steps, but if they have to do some deeper explanation, so one thing we have to get better at is always knowing why they're giving the answers they're giving. And sometimes it just is verbally in the classroom. I think the best math classrooms that I've been in is when you listen to the discourse and it's students articulating their reasoning. And it's other students saying, wait a minute, I did it another way and I think this. And the teacher saying, well, let's take a look at these. It's Sienna and Fo in real life. They're actually arguing about a solution. So we have to be a little bit better about the kind of prompts we give, because if all we're asking for is a drawing, then we're doing the interpreting, and And when we don't really know for sure what the thinking is behind it, let's just look at the second part. Another question says, how big is 4/3? Draw a diagram to show how big it is. What's the definition then? Okay, your job is to come up with a better question. Come up with a better, deeper question. Well, 4/3 is a mixed number, right? It's an improper fraction. So come up with a better question to get it. Do they really understand what improper fractions are? It doesn't have to be 4/3, but at your tables, think about it. Like, how could you ask that in a deeper way to know if they really understand the idea of an improper fraction?